Hey guys! So today we're going to talk a little bit about errors and when to throw an error and when to swallow an error. So let's get into it. So yesterday I was walking through a few comments and there was a comment on one of my old videos where I kind of show you how, well, a few of the considerations that I have when I write a JavaScript function. And there was a person who made a remark saying that he personally would be very careful taking advice from someone like myself who claims that swallowing an error is good practice. Now, I replied back to this and I stated that I don't really see it that way, because swallowing an error is, in my opinion, very different from returning a default value, which is the case in this scenario where basically the function in question that I show you simply has an expected input, and if something goes wrong, it simply returns some form of default value that represents that there was an issue. Now, of course, that led to a little bit of a discussion between, okay, but if you have, that means the same thing, Frederick, that's swallowing an error. No, it's not the same thing as swallowing an error. And we talked about it a little bit back and forth, and let me explain to you why. You see, the fundamental problem with throwing an error, or rather the fundamental benefit when it comes to throwing an error, is that you can, from within the function, express that something has gone wrong. That is what you want to achieve. But although this is a good thing, in my opinion, and a bad thing, it kind of depends on the use case for the logic that you are using. This is at least the argument that I made. You see, if you throw an error, you force one of two things to happen. Now, you can either handle the error from the caller's perspective. In other words, you have to have a try-catch around your function, which is great. You can put a try-catch around your function, and this person actually took the time to write some code to illustrate that that's the way that he suggests that we should do it. And I say, yeah, that's a very feasible strategy to do it. There's nothing wrong with doing it that way. But let me read to you this. If it is true that that's the way that you should express that an error has actually occurred, let's examine a few functions that don't have that behavior. One of my favorite ones, which you probably know about, is index_of on a JavaScript array. So what is the behavior of index_of? Well, if you ask for an element that is not within the array, the index_of function will return -1. It doesn't throw an error, it returns -1. Why? Well, because from the perspective of the function's creator, you can basically only really do one thing wrong here. You can ask for an element that is not within that array. The only thing that you want to express as the producer of this function is that, hey, this person is asking for something that is not within this array. If you throw an error, what is the benefit? You can return a default value, or a value that represents that this did not work as correctly. And the argument that I have for this, or the argument that I presented, was that there's nothing stopping you from getting the return value of this function and validating whether or not it is -1 or not, which is exactly what you have to do with index_of. Now, that amount of code is it's literally the same amount of code as if you had done a try-catch, because instead of having a try around your impure function, because we're going to come to that, because your impure function is throwing an error, you now have to wrap it in a try-catch, and in the catch clause you have to do the graceful handling of the error, which is absolutely accurate from this other person's perspective. There's nothing wrong with it. But as I said, the exact same thing can be done with just returning the default value. Now, if we're talking about swallowing errors, and we kept on discussing, and we also had this argument was represented by simply saying, oh, well, yeah, but if I don't know that, or if I forget to check that value, then this function will never communicate that something's going wrong. And I kind of go, yeah, that is true, but then again, how many times have you seen somebody wrap a impure function in a try catch and simply leaving the catch clause empty. I don't think we'll ever really come to an agreement on this, so all I will do, without going too far, is to tell you the way that I think about this sort of thing. So the reason why I sometimes prefer having a function return a default value as opposed to throwing an error, and there are of course times that I prefer throwing an error as well, but the way that I think about it is that the logic that you are operating on determines the use case. Take index of, for example. If index of forced somebody to throw an error throw every time something went wrong, that would be like, it's a bit of a hassle to have to try catch every index of or substring or whatever in order to just make sure that the damn thing doesn't break. You can like that idea, you don't have to like it, but I think from my perspective it makes a lot of sense, because returning a default value is still going to express that there was an error. You can still validate it. There's no swallowing of an error if there is an incorrect input. It's more about actually understanding that you have to validate the output. That's all it is. It's just, in my world, a different way of doing that, with one limitation, and that is by returning a default value, you are all but stating that there's really only one error that can ever occur. Because if multiple things can go wrong, say that you have a good example is you're trying to access a database. Now, returning a default value from that sort of operation can or cannot be a little bit of a bug. It depends on your perspective. From the way that I look at it, there are multiple things that could go wrong when you access a database and you try to update a value. Let's say that you have an update function and you try to access a database and update a value on your user model, for example. That's a very good, in my opinion, situation where throwing an error would be the way to go, because you don't know, there's multiple things that can go wrong. The connection to the database could go wrong. How do you express that? You can't really do that with a magic value, because then you would have to have a magic value for that possibility. You would have to have a magic value for the possibility of the value not being in the database, or that this property that you're trying to access on that object is, it's not actually a valid thing. Or maybe, since it's an update, maybe you don't have access rights to do this update. There's multiple things that could go wrong with this sort of operation. But indexing into an array and grabbing a value that isn't there, that's really in my world, that's a very one-dimensional problem. And that's exactly what I want you to take away from this. So whether or not you throw an error or you return a default value from a function, depending on your viewpoint, you can still none of them is inherently swallowing an error. In my world, swallowing an error is when you deliberately avoid handling the failure case of a piece of logic. And when we have this discussion between, okay, should we do a functional thing or a pure thing, which is basically, as I said, throwing an error is a no-go. You want to do functional programming, you cannot throw an error. You have to return some type of value that represents that there was an issue. So depending on which practice you want to use, returning a default value is a feasible way for you to actually communicate that something went wrong, and you can take it or leave it, or you can throw an error. But as I said, from my perspective, there's a good use case for both. Have a great day.